Hi everyone. Today's video will be the fifth in a series of 6 on completing the UIS IRB application. Today's video is going to cover sections 7 through 8 of the UIS IRB application. So section 7 covers data confidentiality and privacy. Underneath that is section 7A, which says, how will you identify participant data, records, or specimens when received or collected? Identifiers include, but are not limited to, name, date of birth, email address, street address, phone number, audio or video recordings, and social security number. And we have 3 options to choose from. So the first one is no identifiers will be collected or received, so anonymous. The second option says direct identifiers will be collected or received, confidential. And then the final option says indirect identifiers, for example, a code or pseudonym used to track participants. So for our study, the second option, direct identifiers will be collected or received, so confidential, makes sense because we will probably have participants' names since we're contacting them through social media. We could potentially have their email address, possibly phone number, and we'll certainly have audio or video recordings since we're conducting the interview via Zoom. So second option makes sense for us. This first option, I mostly have seen this with anonymous surveys. So if you were doing an anonymous survey, then you'd want to click no identifiers will be collected or received. The final option, indirect identifiers, I've actually seen this with interviews too. Usually the PIs will assign some sort of code or pseudonym when they're tracking participants. And at the bottom of 7A, it says, does the research team have access to the identity key? We don't have a research team and we don't have an identity key. So I've left this blank. I suppose you could put no, but I don't think it's really necessary in this case, but I'll mark no anyway. 7B says, select all methods used to safeguard research records during storage. So there are 6 different options here. Oh, actually, sorry, there's 9 options. I missed this text box here, but the first option says written consent, assent, or parental permission forms will be stored separately from the data. The second option says data will be collected or given to the research team without identifiers. The third option says data will be recorded by research team without identifiers. The fourth option says, which we've also marked, direct identifiers will be removed from collected data as soon as possible. So again, we want to remove those direct identifiers because we want to keep the participants' information confidential. And then the fifth option, which we've marked, says direct identifiers will be deleted and identity keys will be destroyed as soon as possible. Again, we want to keep confidentiality for the participants, so we're going to delete any direct identifiers that link them to the study. And then the sixth option says participant codes or pseudonyms will be used on all data, and existing identity key will be stored separately from data. So again, we want to keep them confidential, so we might use codes or pseudonyms. And then the seventh option says electronic data will be stored in a secure UIS approved location. And then it says to please specify where and who will have access. We kind of covered this earlier in the application, but I mentioned that I will store this data on a box folder on my personal laptop, and then I will destroy the data after I've used it in my study. So we see this a lot. Most people use Box since UIS pays for the subscription to that. So a lot of people will keep their information on a secure Box folder and usually on their personal laptops. And then they always indicate they'll destroy the data after using it in their study. And again, this is to keep confidentiality. And then the eighth option here says hard copy data will be stored in a secure location on UIS's campus. I've only seen people really mark this whenever they're using a filing cabinet or something like that, but that doesn't apply here. And then there's other, please specify, which doesn't apply to our study. So that covers 7B and all of section 7. So we'll go ahead and move on to section 8, which discusses informed consent. It's also important to note in here that there's an attached informed consent document and completed this part right here, informed consent checklist, which you'll want to fill out after completing the informed consent process, which I should mark which again, after you've completed the section, you ideally want to come back here and then mark that box. So 8A says type of consent, mark all that apply and attach one copy of each relevant form, letter, or script on university letterhead. Include translations if you will obtain consent in a foreign language. Use headings, headers, or footers to uniquely identify each document and associate it with the subject group for its intended use. So the first option says written informed consent or assent with a document signed by adult subjects, parents or legal guardians, or adolescents aged 8 through 17 years. This doesn't apply to our study, and I'll explain why here in a second. But if it did, you'd want to mark the appropriate category here. Under that, it says informed consent or assent with an online document. Since our study is online, this is the one we'd mark. Again, if we were doing maybe in-person interviews, we could mark this first one. But on the second option too, it says in parentheses, please complete a waiver of documentation of informed consent form. This is on our website, and there are two instances when you need to complete a waiver of documentation of informed consent form. So since our study is trying to keep confidentiality for the participants, this would, if we were doing an informed consent form, it would be the only form that links participants to the study. So with that being said, then we would want to keep them confidential. So therefore we need a waiver. So that way participants can't be linked back to the study. And then the second option or second reason why you would need to complete a waiver of documentation of informed consent form is when the level of risk associated with the study is greater than minimal risk and can again pose a breach of confidentiality for the participants. So that's something we'd have to complete along with the application. And again, our audience here is our participants are adult subjects, so we've marked that here. Underneath that, it mentions that children must assent, in other words, voluntarily agree to participation, and a parent must separately provide informed consent on behalf of their child. So in other words, two different forms are generally required. Children under the age of 8 may assent either orally or passively, depending on their level of maturity. Children 8 through 17 years old should sign a written form unless the UIS IRB approves a different process. We're not working with children, so this doesn't apply, but if you were, again, you want to make sure that you're following these guidelines. All right, underneath it says waiver or alteration of informed consent, and then you'll want to attach a request for a waiver form. Again, this is if you plan on altering the informed consent form, but there's specific criteria listed on that document, which again is available on our website, that you'd want to follow. And then you'd mark the appropriate audience here or participants that you're working with. Underneath that, it says waiver of documentation, signature of informed consent. So again, you want to attach a request for a waiver form, and you'll also want to attach a script if you will collect oral consent. And then it says to consult telephone consent guidelines, and then you'll pick the appropriate participant group that you're working with. All right, then 8B says use of proxy. So will others, for example, next of kin, legal guardians, powers of attorney, act on behalf of adult subjects in giving consent to participate in this research? I should mark no here. Yeah, we're working with adults who should be able to consent. So unless they are unable to consent, then we would have to mark yes, and then we'd have to describe who is providing the consent for them. For 8C, use of proxy outside of Illinois. If a proxy is used in research conducted outside of Illinois and or the United States, provide a justification. So for example, statement of an attorney or copy of applicable law that the proxy is authorized under the laws of the jurisdiction in which the research will be conducted to consent on the procedures involved in this protocol. That doesn't really apply to our study. So we'd move on to 8D then, consent process. So we need to describe the informed consent process. For example, how will potential subjects be contacted, who will obtain consent, where and how will consent be collected, etc. So I've said, after I post advertisements on the aforementioned social media sites, I will contact interested participants and ask them if they would be okay with conducting the interview on Zoom. I will message them on the social media sites, which I should have mentioned here, with the attached script and informed consent document. Interested participants can contact me, the PI, with questions as needed. So again, you just want to describe how this process will be conducted. So again, how are you going to contact them? So I mentioned I'll reach out to them, through social media sites. If you need to email them, you can mention that here. However you plan on contacting them. And then you want to mention how you plan on obtaining consent. So again, when I message them, I'm going to send them the script and informed consent document. So that's how I plan on obtaining the consent. And then where and how will consent be collected? Ideally, they would send that back to me, which I suppose I should have mentioned here too, but I think it goes without saying. And then I've also included this little caveat that they can contact me with any questions as needed. And then 8E says, describe all steps taken to minimize the possibility of coercion or undue influence. Again, I think here it's important to mention that, participation is completely voluntary. Really, the only time I've personally come across potential instances of coercion is when PIs will have compensation tied to the study. And again, it's important to ensure that that's not the primary benefit to participants. Otherwise, it could be seen as coercion or undue influence. All right, for 8F, will the prospective subject sign informed consent immediately upon learning about the study? I've left this blank because it doesn't really apply, but you want to mark yes if that is the case or no, and then you can discuss the waiting period between notification and consent. 8G, will participants receive a copy of the informed consent for their records? Again, for us, we would put no, and then we'd say, it would tie them back to the study. But if you want to give them a copy, put yes. And then that concludes this video. In our next video, we'll discuss and cover sections 9 through 12, and it will be our final video of this series. Thank you.